Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar on use of time in comprehensive school counseling programs. I am sure you already know plenty about me if you have joined in on these webinars, but here is just a summary again of my background and my experience. I am currently the school counselor specialist at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. I absolutely love comprehensive school counseling. I have seen firsthand the impact it can make on our work and the outcomes that we can see within our students. And so I am passionate about sharing ways for you to implement it in your school as well. So today we are focusing on adding the use of time tool into your comprehensive school counseling program. Just as a reminder, this is a little bit about us at the Oklahoma State Department of Education Student Support Office. We pride ourselves on providing extensive services for our schools, our families, and our students. So like I said, today we will be talking about use of time. And for those of you who are just now joining me for the first time, if you are not familiar with the ASCA National Model, I urge you to read up a little bit on that or check out my webinar on comprehensive school counseling overview that is also available. Before you dive into this webinar, we get a little more specific in this webinar. And so if you're not familiar with comprehensive school counseling and the ASCA National Model, that would be a good first step, and then come over here and learn about the use of time. So you can see here in our presentation today, we'll go through the use of time calculator. We'll make sure we have a good understanding of those direct and indirect student services, and also those appropriate and inappropriate school counseling activities. We'll talk about how to implement use of time, how to share use of time. We'll look at an example, and then we'll reflect and summarize. Thanks again for joining. I hope you find this beneficial. You often see this if you join me for presentations, because I often hear from school counselors that implementing comprehensive school counseling or the national model is so overwhelming. It seems like I will never be able to do all of that. I'll never apply for RAMP. I'll never get to that top tier. And so it makes them feel as though they should just not do any of it. And I always say that instead of feeling that way, instead remember that every step towards comprehensive school counseling, every step towards the national model better serves your students. It is not meant to be done all at once, which is why we have these webinars broken up into each component. It is meant to be done step by step, and remembering that each of those steps is better for our schools and better for our students. So today we're going to be talking about use of time, which I think is a super fun topic to talk about, because use of time is one of the strongest advocacy tools we have. And I'll talk more about that as we go. But first, let's talk about how it fits into the ASCA National Model. I always like to do a really quick summary, but again, if you want more information about the national model, jump over to those other webinars or buy the book and really dive into that, because we're just doing a very brief overview here. You can see that square includes the 4 components of comprehensive school counseling: define, manage, deliver, and assess. And all of that makes up an outline for school counseling that improves student outcomes. We want our school counseling work to be purposeful and intentional. We want better outcomes as a result of our work. And that is what the national model provides us. It gives us that way to make a positive impact on student achievement, attendance, and discipline by aligning our school counseling program with that overall academic mission of the school. When we create comprehensive school counseling programs, we know that we are keeping all of these things in mind. We are making data-informed decisions. We're delivering that school counseling program to all students, not just some. All students get to benefit from a comprehensive school counseling program. We provide appropriate curriculum that is aligned with those ASCA mindsets and behaviors. We close achievement and opportunity gaps. And of course, again, the result is that improved student achievement, attendance, and discipline. We'll talk more about a lot of those different pieces that I just mentioned in future webinars, so be sure and join us. But for today, we're diving into use of time, and the use of time falls under that manage component. So we saw manage over here on that square, and it is typically considered our second component because we first define school counseling with those standards, and then we begin managing. I often say that the manage component is that behind the scenes work. It is the steps of designing and then implementing the school counseling program that really make sure that what we're doing is purposeful, intentional, all of that. It keeps us from doing those random acts of school counseling. So when we manage our school counseling program really well, then we're able to deliver the best student services, which is that third component. That's when we have those face-to-face interactions with students in that deliver component. But without a strong manage, then we don't deliver our best services. So while sometimes it seems like the deliver component's a little more exciting, a little more fun, if it is not first planned out and designed through that manage component, we're not doing our best work. So that is why the manage component is so important. So let's talk a little bit more about what that manage component is. So again, I consider this that behind the scenes work because it's where we are planning the activities, where we are looking towards what our goals are and what we're going to do to get there. That manage piece really helps us define our priorities based on those student needs. So the use of time fits perfectly into that manage piece because the use of time is where we really focus in on how we're spending our time. You probably could have guessed based on the name. We know that ASCA recommends that we spend at least 80% of our time in those direct and indirect student services. And ASCA provides a use of time calculator that can really show exactly how we're spending our time, where we are spending most of our time in those different components of the ASCA National Model. So the whole reason why the use of time is included in that manage component is because that helps us to really see and really wrap our head around what our day-to-day looks like. And we often find that school counselors think they're spending their time differently than they truly are. They feel like they're providing a lot of direct services, but until we use this use of time tool, we don't really see how we're spending our time. And most of the time, it's pretty surprising. And we want to make sure we have a very accurate view of our use of time so that, again, we know we're doing what's best for our kids. You'll see here that manage component has a lot to it. Each of those bullet points are one of the pieces of the manage component. Again, today we're just focusing on use of time. We'll be sure to record webinars for each of these if you have any questions about the others. But for today, we're diving into that use of time, which you can see there is highlighted in orange. So let's talk a little bit more about that use of time calculator. The use of time calculator helps us document how much time is currently being spent on school counseling activities, those appropriate activities versus those non-school counseling activities, those inappropriate activities that we all know we get caught up in sometimes or get asked to do. It is recommended that school counselors use this use of time calculator at least twice per year. And we'll talk more about that when we look at our example. But the great thing about this use of time calculator provided by ASCA is that the template calculates the totals for you. It graphs the totals for you. Again, such a great advocacy tool. So let's make sure before we dive any deeper into our use of time tool and calculator and why use of time is important, let's make sure we understand the difference between those direct and indirect student services. So in the deliver component, which again, remember today, the use of time is under the manage component, but when we get to that third component, the deliver component, that's when we provide services to students and for students. And those fall under two broad categories. Our direct student services, which is the easy way to think of direct student services, is face-to-face with students. Might be virtual, but it's face-to-face. We can see them. We're providing services for them. Typically, our direct student services fall under three categories. Instruction, so that's when we're providing some sort of instruction and skill building something. Appraisal and advisement, which is that college and career piece. And then counseling, that's that therapeutic counseling direct student service. So typically, our direct student services with students fall under those three categories: instruction, appraisal and advisement, or counseling. It's that face-to-face work with our students. Then that second category is the indirect student services. Those are the services that directly benefit our students, but we're not providing them face-to-face. So for example, collaboration. So when I work with the 11th grade English teacher about a student who has 7 zeros, is not on track to pass, and seems really off task in class and distracted in class, when I work with that teacher to try out interventions, to try out different ways to support that student, I'm collaborating with that teacher. I'm not face-to-face with the student, we're face-to-face with the teacher, not with the student, but it directly impacts that student. So that's collaboration, and that would be an indirect student service. So important, so beneficial, but not face-to-face with students, which is what makes it indirect. Our indirect student services also fit under three categories: the collaboration, which we just talked about, consultation. So that's when you're seeking some sort of consultation, maybe asking somebody for their expertise on an area or giving consultation. And then the third is referrals. So when we're making those referrals to outside agencies, to doctors, to those different other professionals in the community, then that would be, again, super important, really big part of our job, but indirect. So both of those are really important. Sometimes I get the question of, so direct student services are the most important and indirect's not so good. But I urge you not to think of it that way, because yes, of course, we want as much time as we can face-to-face with students, but to truly do our job and to truly use our unique skill set and expertise, we need to also be providing those indirect student services. So like I said, it's recommended that school counselors spend at least 80% of their time in those direct and indirect student services. So there's not a specific number on how much should be direct and how much should be indirect, because it really varies on the student needs. It will vary week to week. It can really depend. And so we don't worry too much about that, as long as we're getting a lot of that face-to-face time with kids and really providing the services that are needed. But we just want the total of that direct student services that includes that instruction, appraisal and advisement and counseling, and then that indirect, which includes the collaboration, consultation, and referrals, together, that to be 80%. Then that remaining 20% would be for hopefully program management and school support services. So that includes this defining, managing, and assessing components of the national model. So like today, we're talking about the use of time. So when we calculate our use of time, that's part of the program management, because it falls under that manage component. And so it's super important. It's not direct or indirect student services though. So we don't want to spend too much of our time doing those pieces. And also, in addition, a small portion of that 20% should be those fair share responsibilities. So lunch duty once a week, car duty once a week, something like that might be fair share responsibilities. The important note with fair share responsibilities is if we're going beyond what is a fair share, so if we are spending an hour every single morning and an hour every single afternoon on car duty, we've gone beyond our fair share, because 2 hours a day for 5 days a week is beyond how much time a school counselor should devote to something like fair share responsibilities. So we'll talk more about that again when we get to our example, but fair share responsibilities, once it gets beyond what's appropriate, then it becomes inappropriate school counseling duties, and we don't want it to get there. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense as we discuss the 80-20. Again, this just goes into more detail about that 80, what we want that 80% to look like. And it really needs to be based on school need and school data. So at one school, it may be that the school counselor really needs to be spending 80% direct face-to-face with students. Maybe they have a social worker and a school counselor secretary that does a lot of the other stuff. And so 80% is really direct student services. But at a different school, you may need to be spending quite a bit of time with the collaborating with the teachers, making those referrals, that sort of thing. I found that the higher my ratio was, so for example, when I was at a school of 480 students, I did want to spend a lot of time in direct student services, that face-to-face. But I also realized that in order to meet 480 students' needs, I was going to have to do quite a bit of indirect student services. So what I mean by that is I was working a lot with teachers to implement some of these things in their classrooms, because I couldn't do it all with 480 high needs students. And so instead of spending a lot of time with face-to-face with students, I was spending more time collaborating and consulting with teachers so that they could implement these things. I still felt like I was doing my job. In fact, I felt like I was doing it at a higher level than I would have been if it was just me face-to-face with students. So hopefully that is clear as mud. All right, so again, just reminding you that 80% is that magic number, and we'll see that when we look at our example as well. All right, so now let's make sure we understand the difference between appropriate and inappropriate school counseling activities. So we want our activities as a school counselor to impact our students, right? We want to positively impact our students. But unfortunately, we are all often assigned inappropriate tasks, and that keeps us from being able to provide that preventative and really strong support for our students. Instead, we end up doing all these inappropriate things, not having time for anything else. And so understanding what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, understanding how to advocate for your role, understanding how to educate about your role is so, so important. If you're not familiar with this document, I encourage you to check it out. It is from ASCA. It's a great little document that highlights the appropriate and inappropriate activities. I love how it's in a chart form. So if you look at those inappropriate activities on the right side, then what ASCA did is then they found a way to make it appropriate. So that very first one says it's inappropriate for a school counselor to build the master schedule. That's not a school counseling activity that's appropriate. But what is appropriate is advisement and appraisal for academic planning. So that's a way we want to provide that advisement and appraisal for our students and helping them understand what their academic plan should look like. So their schedule needs to include certain courses if they have certain goals in mind. And that's that appraisal and advisement piece. Let's see, another one I really like is, where's the test, or let's do the discipline one. I like that one a lot. So I think it's 1, 2, 3, 5 down, that it's inappropriate for school counselors to perform disciplinary actions. So we know that it's not appropriate for school counselors to discipline students. But what is appropriate is providing counseling to students who have disciplinary problems. So when I first started at my first job, my my principal and I sat down and we found out a way to make this work for us. So she understood that it was her job to discipline, but after any conversation with her, the student came and met with me. It wasn't always immediate because I had things on my schedule that I didn't want to miss or move around, but within that day, I would talk with the student as well. And so we could either provide counseling or maybe even provide instruction of ways to prevent the discipline issue from occurring again. Totally appropriate. I was not providing discipline. Those students always knew they were not going to get in trouble with me, but I was able to provide support and help, whereas my principal didn't always have time for that long conversation about all of that. But that was totally appropriate for me as the school counselor to help with that. And I'd also often follow up the next day, check in with the student, see how it's going, see what issues have come up, what has worked, that sort of thing. Totally appropriate, but it took an inappropriate activity into an appropriate activity. So this chart is wonderful. It's a great summary. I'm sure it doesn't include it all. There are other inappropriate activities that are often asked of us, but this is a great chart to share with administrators, with district leaders, school board members, anyone who doesn't quite understand what it is we should be doing and how we can support our students. So again, those non-school counseling duties are not considered non-school counseling duties because we don't want to do them. I never want stakeholders to think that non-school counseling duties are non-school counseling duties because I said so. And I kind of felt that way as a school counselor. I often felt like leaders and principals thought I was just didn't want to do it. And that's not the case at all. The reason non-school counseling duties need to be removed from school counselors' plates is because it takes away time that they could be providing those really important services to students. So helping our administrators understand that is a really big piece of it. And I definitely learned the hard way that there are correct and incorrect ways to bring these up to an administrator. And if we just come off real, I don't want to do that, that's not appropriate, that's probably not the best way to go about it. So when we want to consider steps of how to get these non-school counseling duties removed from our plate, you can see here some recommendations of how to do that. I love this list. I encourage you to check it out later. We will do another webinar that's more about this at another time, but I just wanted to show you there that on this list, it mentions the use of time calculator. It talks about how you can use that data to advocate for duties to be removed from your school counseling program, which is super cool. And that's why this use of time is such an important piece of comprehensive school counseling. So you might be thinking, oh, my school will never change, or I will never get those non-school counseling duties removed. I will never, ever reach the 80-20 recommendation. And I want to remind you that you're right, it can be challenging. This is, again, not something that's done overnight, but it can be done, and it is within our ethical standards that we should be advocating for these to be removed from our plate. So if anyone ever asks you why you want testing removed from your duties, you can tell them that ethical standard B2C states that it is your ethical obligation to work towards getting those duties removed so that you can appropriately serve your students. So let's jump back over to use of time. I know we kind of veered off, but when we think about use of time, it's really important we understand those direct and indirect student services, and those appropriate and inappropriate duties. Because when we look at our example, you'll understand we have to have an understanding of that in order to accurately calculate our use of time. So to implement use of time into our school counseling program, it is pretty easy. We just first want to understand the difference between those student services, which is why we went over that. Then we want to look at how much our time is spent in each component. So that's why we have that calculator, use of time calculator. And then we want to really look at how our time should be spent. So we want to see what the data says and what the outcome goals state, and make sure that our use of time is reflective in that. So, for example, if we have a student outcome goal that is to reduce behavior referrals, and we have an action plan set up to reach that goal. But then when I look at my use of time, I'm not doing any direct student services or indirect student services that has anything to do with reducing behavior referrals. You can see the disconnect, right? Most likely that goal is not going to be met, right? The goal can't be met if none of my time is working towards that action plan and towards that goal. So we want to make sure that it's all in alignment. And as we do more of these webinars and as you listen to more of these, I hope you see how each of these pieces are so interconnected. It's not always brand new. It's very, very connected. For example, if you haven't already checked it out, there's a webinar about calendars. Well, of course, our calendars and our use of time are completely connected, because what we put on our calendar is how we're spending our time. So these things are really, really connected, which makes it easier to implement. And then that last implementation step is to make sure that we're looking at those fair share responsibilities and make sure that we are not being overextended and doing too much of that. We want to be a team player. We want to participate in that. We can even make it super effective. I always said I always wanted 5th grade recess duty, because guess what? That's where a lot of behavior referrals came from. So even though it was technically my fair share responsibility, it was really preventative too, because I got to provide some direct student services during that time. So that was totally fair. I had it once a week, and it was, again, useful, but it didn't go beyond that. So we want to make sure we're tracking that and not going too far into those fair share responsibilities. All right, and making sure that we share what our use of time looks like. It is included in the annual administrative conference template. And if you aren't familiar with the annual administrative conference, check out the webinar about that one, and you can learn more about what that looks like. And if the use of time tool is collected, or if you use that calculator to collect your totals during other times, definitely share that with your administrators and other stakeholders. We want them to know what that looks like, so that if it looks really good, you can brag on yourself and say, look at how many direct student services I'm spending my time doing. Look how much that 80-20 percentage is right, all of that. And if you have room for improvement, it's just as important to share with them, because guess who can help you improve? Those administrators. Yeah. So we definitely want to be able to share that. Also, again, a little advocacy tip. If you ever are fortunate enough to get an inappropriate duty removed from your caseload or your job description, such as testing or 504 coordination, or too many lunch duties, or too many before school duties, or any of those inappropriate activities, then be sure and share what your use of time looks like following that change. Because again, we want our stakeholders to understand how important that is. And so we want them to see, oh, wow, once testing was removed, I was able to provide 85% direct and indirect student services. That is awesome data to share. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing briefly, and then I'm going to jump into our example. Again, this is an ASCA template. do not reinvent the wheel. It is already created. When you download this from ASCA, it is downloaded into an Excel document that I hope you can see now. This is an amazing document that ASCA has created. On this first page, it has your directions of how to use it. So they make it very user-friendly, very easy to understand. And then you'll see here that they have a sample as well. So this can help you understand how to use it for yourself. So let's go through this sample. So you can see here that the time is broken up into 15-minute increments. That's probably appropriate for the UseofTime calculator, because if it's any larger, then we're probably not getting real accurate. So 15 minutes might seem like a lot, but remember, ASCA recommends that you just do this 2 times a year for 5 consecutive days, for a week. So you're only calculating your use of time 2 weeks throughout the entire school year. And you can do spring and fall or whatever time is convenient for you. I always did one of mine during testing when I was in charge of testing, because I wanted my administrator to see just how time consuming it was. So you might even want to be strategic about doing it when your use of time may not look as good, because again, it's an advocacy tool. Okay, so you'll see there the time frames, then you'll see the activity or tasks. So on yours, when we look at these down here, these other days, you'll notice that the activity or task is blank, because you'll fill that in. Because of that, that's why it's really important that you keep on top of this for those 5 days you're doing it, right? Because if you wait till the end of the day and try to think back to what you did at 7 a.m., might be a little difficult to remember. So I always just kept this as an open tab and filled it in throughout the day on those 5 days, twice a year that I was collecting it. So you'll fill in the activity or task, and then you'll put an X under what it is. So this is where it's really important that you understand what those different direct student services are: the instruction, appraisal and advisement, and counseling. And if you don't know, again, I encourage you to get the ASCA National Model 4th edition book, and it gives great descriptions of each of these. And also I'll be providing webinars for each of them as well. So you would put the X, so you can see for this example, the school counselor provided an indirect student service, either a referral, consultation, or collaboration. It looks like it was a parent conference. So that was probably collaboration. They were collaborating with the parent about how to meet the student need. And so they put an X there, and that's all you have to do. Again, this super smart document calculates it for you. You just have to say that for that 15 minutes, I was doing that. You can see here that this school counselor, it looks like that meeting lasted 30 minutes. So they put an X twice. They did one from 7 to 7:15, and then one from 7:16 to 7:30. If the meeting lasted an hour, you would just put 2 more X's there to be from that 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock time frame. So then you'll see next, this school counselor spent quite a bit of time in data collection, which is great. It definitely adds up quickly, though, to those 20% that's not in direct and indirect student services, but we'll talk about that in a second. But so you can see here from 7:31 until 8:45, the school counselor worked on data collection. So they put that under that defining, managing, and assessing activities. Then they provided 5th grade career lessons. That would be that instruction piece. Then they worked individually with a student on goal setting, which falls under that appraisal and advisement. Then they had kindergarten lunch duty for an hour. So that's that fair share responsibility, 1 hour, hopefully only 1 day. So they put that there. Then they went back to doing more 5th grade career lessons. Looks like they then did a 3rd grade group study skill. Oh, maybe a student family issue in there too. So they provided some counseling for a family issue. You'll notice that they used initials because we don't want to break confidentiality. You might not even use initials. I would probably just say a student. Make sure to be extra confidential. And so then they provided a study skills group that was a counseling group. and then another parent conference, so another collaboration with parents, and then they had car duty. Now look here, remember what we talked about. It's okay to have some fair share duties, but this school counselor had already had an hour of kindergarten lunch duty. So this hour of car duty became a non-school counseling task because they've exceeded what would be considered fair share. This is just an 8-hour school day. So to spend 2 hours in fair share responsibility dips into that non-school counseling task, which is why they put that duty over here. Now note, if they wouldn't have had kindergarten lunch duty, if it during that time instead they would have kept on doing career lessons or a group or whatever it may be, then this car duty would have been fair share responsibility. I hope that makes sense. If not, email me and I'll help explain it in a different way. So you'll see here, ASCA does all the calculating for you. So all of the percentages are down here. So it looks like this school counselor on this one day spent 50% of their time in direct student services, which is good. 14% in indirect. So adding that up, 49 plus 14 equals 63, fast math, 63%. So did they meet the 80% recommended direct and indirect student services for this day? No, they didn't. They got 63%, but then 26%, which is over that 20 recommended 20%, was in program defining, managing, and assessing, and then 11% was in non-school counseling tasks because of that too many duties there. So you can see here, this is not bad data. There's never bad data, but this data does show that the school counselor needs to work with their administrator to work towards that 80-20 split that's a little more appropriate. So I love this example because it's not perfect. We're never perfect. It's very hard to get that. Well, let me rephrase that. It is not very hard, but it takes advocacy and working really well with your administrator to get to that 80-20. So this is realistic and it's okay. It tells us a lot of good information and it gives us a lot of room to improve. So you'll see when you download this template that then ASCA provides the each day of the week tab for you to track yours. So you can download it and then just use it, plug it right in, it will calculate it for you. And then, see, I can't, you'll be able to make it into a chart as well. So it's not making a chart right now because my days are blank. But had I inputted the last 5 days in there, then you would have a really pretty chart showing how much time you're spending in each of those areas. We know that our administrators love charts and love to be able to see how we're spending our time. And so that's a great thing to share with them. Instead of printing out these for them and it's hard to really understand what they're trying to communicate, charts are a perfect thing to share with those important stakeholders to share that information. All right, so again, that's a template from the ASCA website. I encourage you to download it so that you can view that, or I'm sorry, so that you can track your use of time and then share that with your administrators. All right, let's jump back over to our presentation as we wrap up here. Let me get to where we were. All right. Okay. So now as we reflect on our use of time, so I encourage you to use this reflection tool. If you've already calculated your use of time, this is a great way to grow from that experience. So answer these questions after you have tracked your use of time. What are the most significant difficulties for reaching that 80% direct and indirect student services? Which of those difficulties can you most effectively work to change this year? And what can you do this year to address that one challenge? So these are 3 super easy reflection questions to just spend some time thinking about after you do that first use of time. I think it's best if you do one use of time pretty early on in the school year. Maybe not those first couple of weeks because they're so abnormal, but maybe if your school starts in August, by late September or early October, do a use of time. Once things have normalized, you've kind of gotten your calendars down, your schedule down, then track your time using that use of time calculator for a week, and then reflect on these questions. If you're able, reflect on these questions with your administrator. Super powerful. Again, no better advocacy tool than that hard data saying, this is how I spend my time, but this is how I should be spending my time to meet those outcome goals, to provide those direct and indirect student services, to do what we're all here to do, right? To support our students. So in summary, it is important that we use that use of time calculator at least twice per year. We want to share those results. We don't want to keep it all to ourselves. Share it with administrators and other school leaders, making sure we spend time to discuss those strengths and areas for improvement. You can consider changing your weekly calendars to reflect more time spent in those areas that are low. So for that example we were looking at, then that school counselor could think, maybe I shouldn't have spent that hour and a half in data collection right in the morning time. Like that's a great direct student service time, right? So they might want to shift that a little bit. So think about how we could change our weekly calendars. And like I mentioned, if you don't use a weekly calendar, I have a different webinar about that if you want to check it out to learn more about using weekly calendars in your comprehensive school counseling program as well. Remember that these really small changes can make such a big difference over time. So if you just slowly work towards closer to that 80-20, like that example, they were at 63. So what if they made the goal of being up to 70% direct and indirect student services? Remember, perfect should not be the enemy of good. We want to make small steps, big difference for our school counseling program, big difference for our kids. And don't be afraid of the results. Like I said, it is okay if you're far from that 80-20. It's no reason to not use the use of time calculator just because you're afraid of what the results might show. We want to know where we need to improve. We want to know how we can advocate. And without data, it's so hard to advocate for what we should be doing. This is an amazing, easy tool that really puts it in terms that all stakeholders can understand, right? We know we're constantly fighting for our role. This really helps. It gives us a great tool in our tool belt when it comes to advocacy. So, as I always like to close with, if you feel overwhelmed by any of this, if it seems like too much or too hard, just remember to ask yourself if what you are doing is best for students. And that answer always leads you in the right direction. I hope that you can see how tracking your time and using that use of time calculator is what's best for kids, because it allows us to provide more direct and indirect student services for them. And that's our goal. If you have any questions regarding this presentation, the use of time tool, or anything else, this is my contact information, email address, phone number. Don't hesitate to reach out. And as always, as Mr. Rogers says here, each and every one of you are my heroes because you see a need and you respond. Thank you for what you do every single day to serve our students. Our students are better because of it. Our world is better because of it. And I am so grateful. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.